We come together at an inflection point in the history of the global women's movement. Secretary Clinton recently said, "I believe it's time for a full and clear-eyed review of how far we have come, how far we still have to go, and what we plan to do together about the unfinished business of the 21st century, the full and equal participation of women." This is your call to action. Against the backdrop of the Beijing +20 and the upcoming post-2015 development goals, we also mark the 15th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. At this point in time, who leads public service is important now more than ever before. From security to sanitation, public service has the most intimate and powerful impact on our lives. A diversity of experiences and plurality of voices are needed to meet the complex challenges of the 21st century. An analysis of available data reveals that despite the fact that women make up over 50% of the population, no country has achieved full and equal participation of women as public sector leaders. Nearly 20 years ago, at the Fourth World Conference in Beijing, governments undertook to work to raise women's representation to a critical mass of 30%. To date, only 37 countries have reached the 30% mark, recognized as the critical mass of change. 9 countries still have no women members at all. However, progress has been made. In 2013, the world average of women in parliament stood at 20.8%. In 1995, it was only 11.3%. In Foreign Policy's Power Issue, the editor points out that the systematic, persistent acceptance of women's second-class status is history's greatest shame. Now, why is women's leadership the cause of our times? First, women's leadership is an economic imperative. It is not just the nice thing to do, but the smart thing to do. How can we harness the evidence that women's leadership yields high dividends in terms of GDP, that it is not just the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do? A McKinsey study shows that women's participation in the market has resulted in a 25% economic increase in the US and a 13% increase in the Eurozone. In Ghana, when women who have equal access to decision-making in fertilizers engage in agriculture, there is a 17% increase in the maize yield. In Pakistan, even one extra year of education for women lowers child mortality rates and increases children's test scores. In China, increasing adult female income by 10% of the average household income raises the number of surviving girls by 1%, as well as the years of schooling for both boys and girls. Secondly, the impact on policy making is what happens when women are at the table. Historically, men drafted laws in the image of men, and women were absent from the table. Across the world, when women are at the table, change happens. Legislatures enact policies and measures that advance the development of women, their families, and their countries. Rwanda boasts the highest proportion of women parliamentarians in the world. Working across party lines, Rwanda's Forum of Women Parliamentarians helped pass a law combating violence against women. In the US, women leaders have helped pass bills that make women and families more secure. This legislation has included the Violence Against Women Act of 1994 and the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. In India, gender quotas at the local government level increased the percentage of women elected leaders from less than 5% in 1992 to over 40% by 2000. Evidence shows that women in elected office in India are more likely to invest in public infrastructure, particularly safe drinking water, and are less likely to feed into corruption than their male counterparts. India's 2005 Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act is a particularly interesting case study. This law, which is one of the most recent laws to be passed in Asia on violence against women, outlaws psychological abuse as a ground of violence and explains that verbal and emotional abuse includes insults of ridicule, especially with regard to not being able to have a child or a male child. This shows what happens when women are at the table. Historically, men drafted laws in their image. When women are at the table, they bring their felt experiences to bear on policy making. Thirdly, when women are not at the table, what happens? Security Council Resolution 1325 calls for women's leadership in post-conflict. When women are not represented in transitional justice mechanisms, their experiences are often ignored in the new narratives of nation building. New constitutions must serve to rectify and not replicate patterns of discrimination against women. For example, it was only because of women's mass mobilizing that the second draft of the Tunisian constitution dropped language stating that women, rather than being equal to men, were complementary to men. Today, the Tunisian constitution enshrines a provision on the right to water. It also outlaws violence against women. What this shows is that when women are at the table, women's felt experiences inform and shape constitution drafting. The Jordanian women's movement is building on the new awakenings in the Arab region to include gender as a prohibited category of discrimination. A review of the 24 peace processes taking place between 1992 and 2010 shows that female representation was as low as 2.5% of signatories to peace treaties and 7.6% of negotiating parties. Only 16% of peace agreements since 1990 have any explicit reference to women or gender. Since the end of the Cold War, only 10 countries' peace agreements out of approximately 300 peace agreements negotiated with respect to 45 conflicts have mentioned sexual violence. Women represent less than 8% of peace processes and fewer than 3% of signatories to recent peace agreements. Finally, no woman has ever been appointed chief or lead mediator in UN-sponsored peace talks. The intergenerational impact of women and women's leadership is one of the most transformative impact of women's leadership. The intergenerational impact of women's leadership is shown in the ways in which, in India, when women lead their communities in local governments, fathers aspire more for their daughters and tend to keep their daughters longer in school. Having a woman in a seat of power can be both transformative and can help inspire peers and a future generation of women. As I said, in communities where women leaders are more visible, fathers tend to send their daughters to school and to keep them in school. Fathers have greater aspirations for their daughters in communities where women leaders are more visible, and female role models impact fathers' attitudes towards their daughters. In India, in villages where women are a majority in the village councils, both fathers and mothers aspire more for their daughters. Maya Yadav, one of the village councillors we work with, says proudly, "In my village, more girls go to school and remain in school. But I'm proudest of the toilets that I built in the schools for girls. Now girls don't have to go to the fields and feel safe in school. A man would never have thought of this." Kim Campbell, the former Prime Minister of Canada, makes an impassioned cry to elect women to office. She asks, "Do you want your daughters and granddaughters to live in a world in which 15% of the national legislators in your country are women?" While role models are important to creating new narratives of leadership, more must be done to dismantle the barriers to women's leadership. What I want to do now is to focus on a toolbox for women's leadership. First, networking. The Harvard Business School Review calls networks the lifeline for women. In Morocco, a Million Woman campaign changed the Mudwana, the family law, and has sparked similar campaigns in countries in the Middle East and North African region. Dilma Rousseff, the President of Brazil, has said, "I stand here as President to open doors for other women to be President." That is the power of role models and the power of networks. 2. Changing the image of power and feminizing politics. On the day of her inauguration, the first inauguration as President, Dilma Rousseff introduced little touches to signal her wish to be not only a woman president, but a women's president. Her black-suited bodyguards were all women. 6 of the motorcycle escorts were women. 9 of her ministers were women. She had wanted more, but the parties who make up the ruling alliance refused to find more women among their ranks, preferring old male politicians. And where she made her first speech as president among deputies, senators, governors from all over Brazil and foreign envoys was a very special group of women, former female political prisoners who had been imprisoned and tortured alongside of Dilma during the military dictatorship. Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, explained her ability to create a network for women. She says, "In the role of president, when I was nominated as one of 3 candidates for the presidency, I was much an outsider because I was a woman. I was young and I didn't come from a political background. Shortly after I was inaugurated, I received invitations from many civil society groups to come and open their center, or some their community activities written on the invitation. And there was advice from my secretary, this event is not of sufficient importance to warrant the presence of the President of Ireland. I ignored that advice and I wrote back, this is an event that the President of Ireland must attend, any event that involves the celebration of women." The third powerful tool in the toolbox is the importance of mentoring. Marian Wright Edelman, the renowned child rights advocate, once said, "Women cannot be what women cannot see. It is important for young women to see role models so that they could be aspire to be the best that they can be." Finally, male champions of change for women's leadership. That is the missing key to women's leadership. Recently, Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, started a conversation about women's leadership in the workforce and the need for women not to bow out of leadership roles. Though it is important and imperative for women to lean in, women have been leaning in for a long time with less than impressive results. What is needed now is for men to lean in when women speak. Former Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, and a Wellesley College graduate, recalls how she was invited to give a speech on Wall Street. She recalls that halfway through her speech, one of the men in the audience stood up and said, "This woman must be stopped." It is important for men to lean in, to listen to women. Male leaders can transform politics and power by championing women in leadership as a public good. Strategic alliances with men are key to unleashing the potential of men and women as champions of change. Reconciling work-family obligations is a very important tool. Historically, male hierarchies were present in the corridors of power and drafted laws. During this time, work-family reconciliation and childcare issues were considered outside of the ambit of lawmaking. With more and more women at the drafting table, laws are being created in the image of women, men, and children. Work-family reconciliation is now becoming a pivotal policy issue at the very heart of gender equality, both in private and public life. The paucity of women in leadership positions in corporations, politics, the arts, healthcare, education, academia, and human rights is mainly due to the disproportionate share of caregiving responsibilities women often carry. In Kenya, Dr. Ruth Onyango, a former member of the Kenyan Parliament, said, "I waited until my last born was a little bigger. I held back my career. The biggest gender inequality gap is in access to inputs, with the largest input gap being time, because women carry a disproportionate household workload." We see how new laws are engaging men and boys in household chores and in caregiving activities. The Vietnamese gender equality law makes provisions for both men and women to take time off to care for sick children. The law also embraces the role of the media in shaping public perceptions on gender and directs the mass media to coordinate with competent government agencies to educate people in gender equality. An important characteristic of this provision is that the Fatherland Front in Vietnam has been asked to engage in gender mainstreaming to achieve equality of the sexes. The importance of including the Fatherland Front in these efforts presumes a good faith effort to engage men in actualizing both gender equality and equal participation in family responsibility. We have to act now. We are at the cusp of change 20 years after the Beijing Platform of Action, 20 years after Secretary Clinton announced women's rights are human rights, now and forever. Without the active participation of women and the incorporation of women's perspective at all levels of decision making, the goals of equality, development, and peace cannot be achieved. And finally, I want to close with Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist's words. Nothing, arguably, is as important today in the political economy of development as the political participation and leadership of women. That is your charge. That is your call to action. Thank you.